Thanks for coming out this afternoon. My name is Bruce Barnes. We're doing the downtown tour today, and we're starting here at the public library. Public library is very important to me. This is where I first started learning about New Bedford's history. It was my first real library job in 1973. Yeah, the library had a special historical collection, two historical collections at the time. It had a genealogy room, which is now the art room. They moved it, they've done a lot of shuffling over the years, and at that time it was called the genealogy room, which was loaded with local history, types of things that we talk about on the tours. And they also had a separate whaling collection, which was in the back corner, which is now the genealogy and local history room. Anyway, and those were my responsibilities at that time. So that's where I started learning about the history of the city. I made it a point of learning as much as I could right away, because I didn't know anything really about the details of New Bedford's history and its whaling history as well. And the library is a very important building here in the city. Built in the 1830s, 1838. It was the city hall and marketplace at the time. That was a pretty common function for city halls at that point. They'd have the city hall offices would be upstairs, and a public market would be downstairs. And the public market sort of disappeared as the decades went on, and it was just a city hall by the time of the early 20th century, say 1900. And in 1906, there was a fire in the city hall, a bad fire in the city hall. And it destroyed a lot of the interior, a lot of records were lost. And at that time, the city decided to rebuild this building as the library rather than the city hall. And the library, which was right across the street, I'll talk about that after this, would be converted, actually completely rebuilt actually, as a new city hall. The library building was designed originally by a man named Russell Warren. He's the guy who did the big granite mansions up on County Street, the double bank building, very, very important architect in New Bedford, really the signature architect in New Bedford, because so many of his buildings are monuments really to the whaling industry. He died in 1860. He was born in the late 1700s. He did a lot of buildings in Providence, Newport, Fall River. But really, I think his most recognizable buildings and his best work was done here in New Bedford. And this is an example. Now, after the fire, the building was going to be converted to the library, and it was completely gutted in the inside. Everything you see on the inside now was designed by Nat Smith. He got the job of reconverting the library the city hall to the library. And there are pictures of the interior of the library completely gutted, absolutely empty from wall to wall and from floor to ceiling. And so everything you see now, which is a beautiful attempt by Smith to replicate the Greek Revival style of the 1830s, the mosaic floors and the beautiful marble staircases, the rotunda, all designed by Nat Smith. It took a number of years actually to finish the project. Now, the video will have what the City Hall looked like. It was not as big as it is now. The wings on both sides, there's two here and on the other side, and the back end of the library were added by Smith during the reconstruction of this building from 1907 to about 1909. The cornerstone actually on the wing right here says 1908, so that's probably when that wing was completed. but I don't think the project didn't come to full completion until 1909 and maybe even 1910. As people who remember the library, if you're familiar with the library from way back, the back end of the library was the stacks. If anybody knew the library back then, the back end of the library, the addition in the back was the stacks, and it was a glass floor construction. Kind of cool, actually. The floors were, the ceilings were very low, high, and it was kind of a legend in its own time, the back end of the building. That's all been changed. They did a lot of remodeling over the years, did a major remodeling of the library, I don't know, 15 years ago maybe, and it doesn't really look anything, the back end looks nothing like it did when I worked here. Anyway, it's a great building, completed in 1910. So at the same time that they were redesigning the City Hall into the library, they were redesigning the library, which was right across the street, into the City Hall. Now, we're going to be walking down this way afterwards, and that plaque over there, right on the sidewalk, has a picture of what the library looked like. I'm also going to show a picture of the library as it appeared in 1892, because there was an addition at that time. But the original library, there's a picture of it on that plaque there, so as you walk by, you can look at it. The library originally was a square building, and this wall on the Pleasant Street side, not that addition right there, this wall here is an original wall to the library that was built in 1850. And basically, there was 3 bays on each side. So the original facade of the building was right here. It didn't go as far as the front of the building now. It wasn't a very big building. And at some point, I'm not sure when an addition was made to the library, that L there was added, and more room on the back side of the building here. So when you look at the picture that'll be in the video, we'll show that L and also this part of the building. Now, one of the redesigner of the library to the City Hall was Samuel C. Hunt. I mentioned him in other tours, very important New Bedford architect. He did the building right behind the library here, the registry as well. But he was given the job of rebuilding this building. He had really, even though Smith had a big job in the interior designing the library, Hunt had to rebuild the building. Because there was only 1 floor in the library. You can see there's 2. I've been to City Hall. You know, it's 2 floors now. But there's only 1 floor in the library originally, and there were large windows on that side that went all the way to the room at top. So you could tell it was just a 1-floor building with a big giant expanse and one on the first floor, on 1 floor. Anyway, Hunt designed this building. It was finished about the same time. Unfortunately for Hunt, he had what was called Bright's disease, which was a kidney disease, and he died young. He didn't see the completion of the building. But nonetheless, he replicated the style of the building and that it would have possibly looked like if it was built in the 1850s in this Renaissance revival or Italianate style. The original designer of the library was a man named Solomon Eaton. And Eaton was from Mattapoisett, but he always had an office in New Bedford. He did a number of buildings. He probably did a whole lot more than have been identified during the 1840s and 1850s. He did 100 Madison Street, which has been on the tour a lot, Ron Mack's old house, and the couple that lives there now, I don't know their name, they lived right across the street from us, but that was one house. He also built the Pacific Union Church, which was where the Octopus is now, all that development. So we know he did a number of houses. He probably did a whole lot more. And the interesting thing about Eaton was that he was born in 1806, and at the outbreak of the Civil War, he was 55, and he joined the Union Army. He actually saw combat in North Carolina as a 55 plus patriot for the Union cause. So interesting guy, came back to survive the war, started designing again, and died at a job site in Middleborough. Now, when you go through the center of Rochester, where Plum's Corner, if you're familiar with Rochester, Plum's Corner, there's all those public buildings, all Solomon Eaton. The public buildings and churches in Mattapoisett and Marion from the 1850s and 40s and 50s, Solomon Eaton, he did a lot of work in those two towns, and he also did a lot of work here in New Bedford. Now, of course, one of the great structures in New Bedford is the Whalemans Statue, right here. This was a gift to the city from a man named William Wallace Crapo. He was one of the biggest movers and shakers in New Bedford for the time, basically from the 1870s until he died in 1926. He was 96 when he passed away. And he was the president of the big banks. He was the president of Wamsutta. He was just a very, very powerful man. But in 1913, or before 1913, he decided he was going to give this monument to the whaling industry, to the city. He hired a sculptor by the name of Bella Pratt, not the most important sculptor in the United States at the time, but fairly accomplished in his own time, pretty well known. And they produced this beautiful sculpture of a harpooner or boat steerer, as they were called technically, ready to thrust his harpoon into a whale. A dead whale or a stove boat. That means a dead whale or a smashed boat. That's what stove means. And that was sort of the statement that made, anything goes, the dead whale is the most important thing. That's what that means. The base itself was designed, again, by Nat Smith, one of New Bedford's most important architects. I mentioned the same guy who did the library. He did the base as well. A couple other buildings I want to point out before we move on. Right across the street here, the big brick building originally was called the Odd Fellows Building. That was a fraternal organization. There are still Odd Fellows. It's like a Masonic organization, or the Elks and so forth. There are still Odd Fellows in other parts of the country that have, just like Masons and other types of fraternal organizations. I don't know how many Odd Fellows there were in the fraternal sense in New Bedford in the 1890s, but they built this a beautiful building. The upper level of the original building, now there'll be a picture of this building, of that photograph on the video, was a magnificent design, all kinds of turrets and so forth at the top of this building when it was first built in 1889. The architect of this building was Caleb and Edgar Harding, probably Edgar Hammond. He was the chief designer of that firm. Really quite a spectacular building. It still is a spectacular building, but a lot of the ornamentation from the original site was taken down when the Duffs bought it in 1934. The Duff family, the R.J.D. Duffs, the Cole Duffs, they purchased the building in 1934, and it's possible that some of that ornamentation was at risk of falling. I don't know why, but they stripped it all off, evened off the third floor level, even took some of the arched windows. There were more arched windows on the building at that time, but they took it off. But it's still quite a spectacular building in the Romanesque style that was popular in the late 1880s. The building right across the street was originally a bank building. It was the Textile Trust Building, 1918. It's a nice building, actually. It's pretty attractive. It was vacant for years and years. When I was working here, it had been vacant for like 10 or 15 years then, and it's continued to be vacant afterwards. It was briefly a restaurant. Doesn't anybody remember when it was the Vault Restaurant for a short period of time? Anyway, it was briefly a restaurant, and then it again was vacant for a while, and finally the New Bedford Art Museum took it over. It was called the Textile Trust, established in 1918. Charles S. Ashley, long-term mayor of New Bedford, and John Neild, one of the owners of a mill, were the primary establishers of the Textile Trust. It didn't stay Textile Trust very long. It became the Safe Deposit Company, which I think the name is still across the top, maybe. It used to be Anyway, it was the safe deposit company for many years, and then it was vacant after that. Before we move on, I want you to look at the tip of the harpoon on this on the Whalemans statue. That is called a temple toggle. The temple toggle is a mechanism at the end of the harpoon when it goes into the whale. They can't pull out because that toggle goes perpendicular to the shaft of the harpoon. And the temple toggle was invented by this man on the next statue. So let's walk down here. This is a statue of Lewis Temple. He was a former slave, came to New Bedford, worked as a blacksmith. He was born approximately 1800 and died in 1854. Probably got the idea from South Sea Islanders like Queequeg from Moby Dick for the technique. But anyway, it was always called the temple toggle. If he had any kind of stature and money, he probably could have patented his invention, but of course he didn't have the ways and means to do that. He did make some money out of it because he started making the toggle harpoon, but then everybody started to make it because it was clearly a superior way to have the weapon. Now, Temple, there's a couple of, when I was looking up Temple, I knew about Temple from way back, but when I wanted to get more detail about him, and there's lots of misinformation or different versions of his story. One of them is that he didn't have any children, but clearly he did have a son, because in another source, they said there was no actual photograph or image of Lewis Temple himself, but his son had photographs of himself. So that's they used the son's photograph for this particular statue. And also, he died when he fell into a manhole or a construction site. I was walking home in the dark one night. His blacksmith shop was right on the water, I think at the foot of School or Spring Street, right by the waterfront. Fell into a hole that the construction guys, the city construction had done, like a sewer hole or something, and he passed away as a result of his injuries. And one of the sources said that his wife sued the city for $2,000 and that she never got the money. But then there's another source that said she did get the money. The same source that identified, so there's a lot of misinformation about Temple and his lifeline. He definitely had a son because he's in the directory. He was a hairdresser of all things. Can you imagine? From a blacksmith to a hairdresser. Anyway, very important guy, and for his invention of the updated harpoon. Across the street, there are two important buildings. Not going to talk about them much. The one on the right is the Boys Club or Union of Good Works. Again, a building by Nat Smith. This has been converted to residential, I believe. I'm not sure what it is now, but it was a boys club and so forth, and there was room for basketball and all that. But it had a spectacular inner stairwell that had divided at the top. Really was a spectacular stairwell for a boys club. And right next door is the Standard Times building, or the Evening Standard building, originally 1890s. This was designed by Peabody and Stearns, a very, very important national architectural firm that's done quite a bit of work here in New Bedford. And by the time of 1900, there were at least three daily papers in the city at that time. The Evening Standard, which was an afternoon paper, the Morning Mercury, which was a morning paper, and the New Bedford Times. I'm not sure when the New Bedford Times came out. This building right here on the corner is called the Masonic Building. It's a nice building. The unique part about this building is that all this ornamentation is metal. Very unusual. They didn't use metal in this type of in buildings like this very often. Each city has maybe a building or two. Wasn't popular for long. This is a Peabody and Stearns building, but nonetheless, we have metal along the edge here, and on this particular building. Kind of a unique thing about this building and even in New Bedford. I don't think there's another building in New Bedford that has this quality of metal ornamentation on the outside. It also has a beautiful plaque way. You can't see it very well from here, but right at the top there. Nice plaque of I think it was a Masonic symbol. It's called the Masonic Building because it was owned by and built by the Masons as an office building. The building right here is, as you can see, is the Eddy Building. Interesting family of merchants, retailers. The father, whose name was George Eddy Sr., he had a retail establishment on this site from just after the Civil War. And it was pretty successful, very successful. Legend has it that Eddy was the first retailer to employ women as sales clerks. It's hard to believe that it would take that long, 1860s and 70s, but anyway, nonetheless. Now his sons were George Eddy Jr. and Abraham Eddy. And around 1880, they decided to build a whole new retail building right on the site of the old. They demolished the old building that the father had established, and they put this building up here. 4 stories, but kind of a big department store for 1889. Again, legend has, I always hate to say that it was the first of this, first of that, because then somebody will call me up or email me and say, no, there was another one somewhere else, So anyway, but legend says that this is the first building to have an elevator for customers, all 4 floors. Now the Eddys must have made a lot of money during the time because the city was doing quite well in the 1880s, and around 1890 they decided just to sell the store and get out of, and retire. Their 2 houses, one on one side of the street and one on the other side of the street, are on Maple Street. George Eddy Jr.'s house is the beautiful stick style that's got a lot of staging around it now, on Maple Street, and right across the street, the green one, was Abraham's house. Now, across the street, we have one of the truly signature buildings in New Bedford, the Star Store. Star Store was built in 1913. The architect of the Star Store was a man by the name of Louis Detrompe. He was born in Quebec. His father was an architect who settled in Fall River, actually. Detrompe and his brother Victor worked for his father briefly. Detrompe actually came to New Bedford to take over the building of the St. Anthony's Church. I'll talk about that in a second. But this particular building is a beautiful building, really more so recognizable for especially people who've lived in New Bedford a long time. It was a very, very memorable department store. This was the department store in New Bedford for many, many years. It actually didn't close until 1985. Laid vacant for many years. And then when the university, UMass Dartmouth, had the opportunity, with the help of our local legislators in the state legislature, to convert the Star Store into part of the CVPA, the College of Visual and Performing Arts, really was one of the great things that happened to downtown, because it brought a new revitalization of the downtown, bringing all these people to the city. The building itself is really quite attractive. All this white stone that you see here is from Indiana. It's Indiana limestone. That was a very highly sought after decorative stone for buildings at this time. Indiana limestone. All across the top, all that white stone is Indiana limestone. Now, the building had deteriorated before it was rehabbed. And Tony Souza, who was the leader of Whale at the time, when they were doing this, he found a material that looked exactly like Indiana limestone. It's a composite of some sort. So all the repairs were done in that material. But nonetheless, all the top part is original and it's still a beautiful building, typical of the neoclassical style that was popular with the arched windows and so forth. And it still is a nice landmark in the city. The building across the street, New Bedford Institution for Savings. Now, when this building was built in 1896, you have to try to imagine, again, there'll be a postcard image actually of this building when it was originally built at that time. And it didn't include that addition over there. It just included this big box at this point here. And it was a magnificent building, really. It's a magnificent exterior building. It's like a Roman temple. It's like they dropped a big giant temple from Rome itself onto the site. It looks so spectacular without the addition. The interior, if you've been many people have been in the interior of this building during when it was Oceanarian or when it was still the bank, spectacular interior. Newport Mansion quality materials in the lobby of the huge lobby, big giant tall walls. Sienna marble from the Roman, from the Italian quarry in Sienna with that yellowish marble. Spectacular building. All of the highest grade mahogany from Central America and the Caribbean was used in the detailing of this building, and when it was like really Newport Mansion quality interior on this building. 1896. The architect of this building was Charles Brigham. He's the guy who did all the buildings for Henry Huddleston Rogers in Fairhaven, the high school, the Millicent Library, Town Hall, the big church, Charles Brigham. And even in the postcard, it just looks like a beautiful building. The problem was, it was almost obsolete the minute they opened it, because New Bedford was growing like crazy and didn't have enough office space right out of the box. So they had to build this addition to make the building a competitive commercial building. And to me, it completely ruined the original building. When you see the postcard image, you'll see what I'm saying. It really looks like a spectacular site at the time. The interior, I hope, is still in there, at least mostly as it was, because really, it was like walking into Marble House when you walk into the first floor, because of the very high ceilings in this particular building. About 15 years ago, my wife's family lives on Long Island, and we go and visit them, try to find something to do when we can. And one time, Kath and myself and my sister-in-law Doris and Kath's mother, we went out to Stony Brook, Long Island. They have a carriage museum, and they were having a special exhibit. They had a separate art gallery. They were having a special exhibit on Norman Rockwell. So we said, we can't go wrong here, because Kathy and I love horses and carriages, the old-fashioned stuff and whatnot. So we go out to this place in Stony Brook, Long Island. We walk into the carriage exhibit, and right in front of us is a stagecoach, a beautiful stagecoach. It says Mattapoisett in New Bedford. What is this doing here? It was a perfectly beautiful stagecoach. And a guy said, and it said C.T. Fuller underneath. The guy's right above the door of the stagecoach. It was just like a Wild West stagecoach. It's a Concord stagecoach, just like you see in all the movies and so forth. Beautiful stagecoach. Well, come to find out, this C.T. Fuller, he was from Mattapoisett, and he wanted to have freight and passengers run from New Bedford to Mattapoisett. And here's where the stop was, right here, right on this corner, right over there. He had a slate against one of these poles that had his schedule and his fee rate. He took passengers and freight. He operated the stagecoach from around 1880 to 1900. The stagecoach was described in the catalog of the museum in Stony Brook as having been built probably around 1875 in the famous Concord plant, the Abbott Downing plant in Concord, New Hampshire. And we got a nice picture of it, put that on the video so you can see what it looked like. Beautiful, it's like in pristine condition, like it just rolled off the showroom. It was in such beautiful condition. And all I could think of is, boy, if that museum ever goes out of business, we have to send somebody down there and bring that back home because it was beautiful. This is one of the few Art Deco buildings in New Bedford. This is the Cherry and Webb building, designed in the early and built in the early 1930s. Probably one of the few buildings of any kind built in New Bedford during the Great Depression. The architect was a man by the name of Herbert Hunt. He was born in Lowell, did a lot of projects for Cherry and Webb, actually, a lot of stores and so forth. The one in Fall River, all the Cherry and Webb, pretty much all the Cherry and Webb department stores, or Cherry department stores originally, were designed by Hunt. And it's one of the few really major Art Deco styles. You can see how it looks just like the Deco buildings of other places like South Beach, Miami, and so forth. His masterpiece, and it is a beautiful building, is an apartment building in Cranston, not too far from the Rhode Island border, called the Rosedale Apartments. Look it up online. It's a beautiful building. That's his best building. It's really a very attractive building, Rosedale Apartments in Cranston, Rhode Island. Herbert Hunt. On this corner is the Merchants, two versions of the Merchants Bank. A brief word about the Merchants Bank. The Merchants Bank, around 1900, was the commercial bank in New Bedford, and it continued to be the commercial bank in New Bedford really into the 1960s, actually. This is where the big money was placed. This was where the big money was invested, managed for the important and wealthy residents of the city. The double bank building was one of the merchant banks. They had other location before they built the one behind here, the one with the pale sort of brick here. That was built in 1893, and it came all the way out to the corner. Actually extended almost, it extended into what is now the street in 1893. Around 1910, the city wanted to widen Purchase Street. Purchase Street, when you look at old photographs of Purchase Street from the Spinner illustrated books and so forth, you realize how narrow Purchase Street was. And by the time 1910 was coming along, there were automobiles, streetcars, and they needed more room. So they were going to widen Purchase Street. And they were going to take off the front of the Merchants Bank. So rather than just push back the original bank a little bit and then rebuild it, they decided to push it all the way back to there and build a new bank right in front. Man, that's what you call adaptation. So the new bank was built in 1913. And the old bank was cut back to this point. There's going to be on the video, there'll be a picture of what the old bank looked like. It had the entrance was right on the corner and had a sort of a rounded front end. This building here had the same thing happen to it. This was the Cummings building right here. And it was kind of an Italianate style office building. It looks not too much different, a little bit older actually than the Eddy Building. It looked like that, had a nice brick facade and so forth. And they completely redesigned this building too. They had to take the front off, and they ended up changing the entire look at the building at that time. But they didn't build a new building in front like they did here. Merchants Bank, the new Merchants Bank from 1913, again, lots of marble on the inside. Pretty impressive building, not nearly as impressive as the Bedford Institution for Savings, but nonetheless, a nice building. Urban renewal came to New Bedford in the 50s and 60s and lost a lot of buildings during those years, a lot of buildings. You can see the Purchase Street continued all the way down, if you're familiar with where the former New Bedford Tech buildings are now. Purchase Street extended all the way down there. There was no octopus and so forth. There was all neighborhoods, commercial buildings, so forth, completely destroyed during that time. On this site here, there was a church called the North Congregational Church, built in the 1830s. On this side over here, where the Bank of America is now, There was the Olympia Theater. People remember the Olympia Theater? It was a big, fairly large movie theater on the corner. And next to it originally was, not that came down during the urban renewal, but the North Christian Church, a spectacular church built in the 1830s. Again, another Russell Warren building. It had an enormously tall steeple. That's the steeple. If you remember the panorama, that's the steeple that everybody used as a landmark for where, if they were traveling anywhere to New Bedford, even from the land, you knew where you were by this gigantic steeple. The North Christian Church was taken down in the 1920s, but the Olympia Theater and all these other buildings that people remember from the old days all came down and not replaced really by anything that was better than it was before. That was the thing. It was supposed to be replaced by all kinds of good stuff, and it didn't really happen. On this side of the street, in say 1900, this whole block was the Parker House. John Avery Parker was a whaling merchant, and he was one of the first settlers during the whaling industry to build a large mansion. And he built a large mansion on this site, sort of like the Mariners' Home, that style mansion on the Mariners' Home. And in 1830, he decided he needed even a bigger mansion. He built the magnificent mansion that historians are all familiar with by the park, the common park, the John Avery Parker Greek Revival. Lots of pictures and books about that. It's probably the greatest residential property ever built in New Bedford. But his original house was right here. And when he moved out, investors bought the property and expanded it into a block-long hotel. There'll be a picture of the Parker House on the video with the way it looked around 1900. It was like 4 stories. It had and now they built these big columns in front of a part of the building, and it was the biggest and most desirable hotel restaurant in New Bedford. It looked like just a federal-style building, really, but it was very, very fashionable at the time. In 1874, Ulysses S. Grant, who was President of the United States at the time, took a boat ride up and down the Atlantic coast, and for one day, he got off his boat, docked in New Bedford, and had lunch at the Parker House. He didn't stay overnight in the Parker House. He got back in his boat and spent his night on the boat. But nonetheless, in 1874, a president visited the Parker House and ate here. Around 1916, there was a fire at the Parker House. It wasn't a burn the house down type of fire, but it did it did compromise certain parts of the building. It was abandoned, laid vacant for a number of years, and in 1920, it was torn down. And what replaced it was the same investors who had built the Olympia Theater over here. They built the Olympia Building in 1920. And the Times building is the one at the end. That was built around 1900, again designed by Nat Smith, and that was one of the newspapers in town at the time. The New Bedford Times was in operation from around 1900 to 1930, when it merged with the Evening Standard to form the Standard Times in 1932. So that's the history of this block here. You had the North Christian Church, which occupied the whole block for many years, and then a part was sold for the Olympia Theater, which was a very large theater, actually, a very high capacity theater. The theater was built in 1960 and demolished in 1969, I think it was. But nothing really. I mean, a big giant ugly bank has replaced those two buildings. I mean, what really, the promise of urban renewal in cities like New Bedford, Fall River, and others was never really realized in any meaningful way. That's today's tour. This is the last tour of the season. Thank you all. All of you people have been on all the tours. Thank you for coming to each one of them. It would be very difficult for me to do this without at least a few people to talk to, because it just didn't seem right. So I appreciate you all coming to all the tours.